Well, when I was a little girl, the mine was still working. But my grandfather, of course, was not working then, but the mine was still working. And in those days, we're talking something like 1939, health and safety was quite different to today. And you could walk through the mine, which was a shortcut to get to my grandmother's house. And you walk through, and there was this huge thing. We may have a picture of it. It's called a balance box. And it was to do with the pumping of the engine. And it was a huge, great thing, like a great big black iron coffin that went up and down. And it was seated in a very shallow pit. And as it went up and down in this pit, it used to look really creepy, horrible looking thing. Well, now it would have fences around it and notices saying, keep off. So I said to my father, who led me past this thing, and he said, boys used to play on that, jumping on it as if it were a seesaw, because the movement was like a seesaw. And he said, the boys used to jump on that and see if they could jump off before it went up again. So I said, oh my goodness, because that seemed horrifying to me. And he said, oh, well, the thing is, one day a boy went in there and he was killed. He got caught between the edge of that and the concrete pit it was in. So I said, oh my goodness, so what happened? He said, well, nobody ever did it again. I thought that was health and safety in those days. He said, no one ever did it again. Then my other grandfather, he worked at the big mine, which was called Dalcoath. And I don't know quite what he did, but he had occasion to go into what they called the engine room. Now, the engine room, from what my mother used to say, because she would see it as a little girl, the engine room was, I expect you all know what engine rooms are kept like on a ship, or like they used to be before it was all electronically controlled. And in this engine room, it was all kept exactly as if it was a ship. And the men, you know, wiped their feet to go in, no one got muddy. And the people who were the engineers, I mean, they were the elite of the mine. And electricity had come there, which I think electricity was quite late coming to Cornwall. And this man that worked in the engine room had caught a hold of two handles and he became electrocuted. And my grandfather, who didn't realize that the current would go through the man's body into his body, leapt forward to pull him off, and the charge went through my grandfather. So he was very lucky not to be killed. Now, I don't know whether the man was killed or not, but he was lucky not to be killed. And the doctor just came and said, oh, well, that would either have killed you or put 10 years on your life. So that's another example of health and safety. There's something I've always heard from a child, told by my Auntie Olive, who wasn't my real aunt, but we called her that she used to talk about her father when he worked in the Beacon mine. And she used to say that as he was in the engine room, there was a big engine that used to power the gear that pulled the men up and down the mine. And she always told this tale about one day this careless man, or maybe it was just an ordinary mistake, the man probably wasn't careless, the cage which was being brought up would go up and down, but there was a certain point past which it could not go unless there was a disaster. And she used to say it was puppet heads. And I'd always heard this, but no one else ever seemed to have heard about it. And only last year, I went down to the National Trust place at Geever and was just coming out of the place and saw on the wall something about puppet heads. So I asked the men and they explained it. And that was always a legend, which I don't suppose many people actually believed her, but actually she was telling the right thing. Had those men gone up there, and her father intervened, and I don't know what he did, but he must have stopped the gear so that he averted the disaster. So that was their family legend. Another example of health and safety. Children could walk through the mine, and when my mother and aunt were little, and all my aunts and uncles apparently, in the school holidays, the children would be able to take what they called kroust, which was their lunch, to their fathers. And they could, you know, run loose on the mine, I think, just around and speak to everyone they knew, and no one would turn them away. And just as an example of how people weren't exactly poor, but they were working people, and their pride in showing their status in life was cleanliness. And they used to have the lunch used to be taken in these white bags that they used to, because if they bought flour then, they bought it in very big bags, which were made of white cloth. And so these cloths would be put and boiled until they were really, really white, and then they would be cut up. And the little girls used to learn to sew, my mother said, by making these bags for their fathers to carry the lunch in. Now, that was a status symbol, because if you had a wife that didn't do good washing, the bag would be grey. But every mother would make sure that the bag was really, really white. And my mother said, they would say, don't you get that bag dirty on the way? Because the bag was a status symbol among them.